April 30th, 1943. The air at the train yard in central Texas was thick with dust, warm wind sweeping across flat fields dotted with mesquite. A line of boxcars groaned to a halt, brakes hissing like a tired beast. Inside, dozens of German prisoners of war shifted uneasily, peering through cracks in the wooden slats. They had crossed an ocean in chains of rumor and fear, told that America would humiliate them, starve them, maybe even parade them through towns as trophies. Their uniforms were stained with the red earth of Tunisia, and their eyes carried the hollow look of men who had marched too far under too many suns. As the doors creaked open, the men braced for blows. Instead, they saw wide Texas skies, an expanse so open it seemed to swallow their breath, and soldiers in clean khaki uniforms who looked almost bored. The prisoners stumbled out into the light, their boots crunching against gravel. They expected the rifle butts of guards, snarled orders, and snarling faces. But the American guards, many barely older than the captives, simply watched with a casual steadiness. Some leaned lazily on their rifles as if this were another routine job in the long grind of war. A sergeant flicked open a lighter, shielding it from the wind, and lit his own cigarette with the calm of a man on his porch. The smell of burning tobacco drifted across the air, strange in its normality. For the Germans, who remembered cities bombed into rubble, families scavenging for crusts of bread, this ordinariness felt surreal. War was supposed to end in torment. Yet here, it seemed to dissolve into the mundane. As they were marched toward trucks waiting nearby, the Germans whispered among themselves. Some muttered that this was only a trick, that the real cruelty would come behind the camp gates. Others clutched at their belongings, small pouches, battered helmets, a few photographs tucked into coat linings. One young soldier, barely 19, stared at the horizon with wide eyes, trying to imagine what captivity in this strange country might look like. For him, the thought of being thousands of miles from the Reich was like falling into another world entirely, where the rules of survival had been rewritten without warning. The trucks rumbled along country roads, past farmsteads and fields where children waved as if watching a parade. The prisoners expected jeers, perhaps stones thrown, yet they received curious stares instead. Some Americans tipped their hats, more out of habit than hostility. It was the first taste of contradiction, enemies treated with indifference rather than hatred. For men raised on propaganda of American savagery, it was a disorienting moment, like stepping into a play where the script had been replaced. They rode in silence, the countryside unfolding in waves of wheat and cotton, the distant silhouettes of barns and windmills breaking the flat horizon. Captivity felt less like punishment, more like an entry into a land untouched by the horrors they had known. When the convoy reached the camp, the prisoners stiffened once more. Barbed wire fences glinted in the sun. Guard towers stood tall, rifles slung over shoulders, but even here the atmosphere was oddly methodical, not menacing. The gates opened with the clank of iron, and the men were led inside. They were shown barracks lined in neat rows, wooden bunks stacked with clean mattresses, kitchens already steaming with food. Some blinked in disbelief, unable to reconcile this with the grim expectations fed to them on foreign soil. One whispered under his breath, "This is not war. This is something else." The words hung heavy, as if forbidden. To admit that an enemy had given more comfort than their own commanders was almost treason to the mind. The Americans checked names, issued identification tags, and handed out rules of conduct. The regulations were stern but not cruel. Prisoners were told they could send letters, would be paid small wages for labor, and would be fed according to international law. A guard explained these rights in slow, deliberate English, translated by an interpreter, and the Germans exchanged glances. They had been taught that Geneva was a dead word, a fantasy meant to soften fools. Yet here it was being lived, enforced by the very people they had sworn to destroy. The irony was bitter, but beneath the bitterness stirred something else, confusion, and perhaps a fragile kind of hope. That evening, the camp mess hall echoed with clattering plates. The Germans sat together at long tables, waiting for meager rations of thin soup and stale bread. Instead, steaming trays of meat and potatoes appeared, thick bread with butter, vegetables boiled until tender. The smell alone stunned them. It was food many had not tasted in months, richer than what their families endured under blockade and ration cards. Some ate cautiously, convinced the abundance was an illusion. Others devoured every bite, shame prickling their pride but hunger overpowering principle. The guards ate the same meal at adjoining tables, laughing, talking about baseball games, a war fought half a world away. The Germans listened in silence, their ears catching words of leisure while their own memories bled with battles and loss. In the corner of the room, a crate was opened. Glass bottles clinked together. At first the prisoners thought it was medicine, perhaps disinfectant. But the unmistakable hiss of caps being pried off filled the air, and suddenly beer was placed on the tables. Some stared, unable to lift the bottles. Others chuckled in disbelief, the sound breaking into nervous laughter. Cigarettes were passed out next, neat white rolls of tobacco pressed into calloused hands that had expected shackles. A guard, grinning faintly, gestured as if to say, "Relax, it's yours." The hall filled with smoke, with murmurs, with a surreal energy that blurred the lines between captor and captive. The prisoners looked at each other, eyes wide. In that moment, the war outside seemed impossibly far away. For some, the taste of beer on the tongue was the strangest betrayal of all. It tasted not of victory or defeat, but of humanity, as if the world had decided, just for tonight, not to be cruel. Men who had survived desert campaigns, who had buried comrades in shallow graves, now sat under wooden rafters sipping a drink they thought they would never touch again. It was absurd. It was comforting. It was terrifying. Because if the enemy could be kind, then everything they had believed about loyalty, sacrifice, and the fatherland began to wobble beneath them like a house on weak foundations. As the lights dimmed and the prisoners returned to their barracks, many lay awake on clean mattresses, staring at the ceiling. They did not speak of what had happened. The silence was too heavy. Each man wrestled with the same unspoken question: what did it mean to be treated better by the enemy than by one's own leaders? Smoke still lingered in the rafters, mingled with the smell of food and the faint echo of laughter. For some, it was the first night in years they slept without fear. Yet beneath that uneasy comfort, a current of dread ran deep. If captivity could be this humane, what else had they been wrong about? And what would the next day bring, when the illusion of kindness might shatter, or deepen into something even stranger? The first morning in camp was crisp, the Texas sun lifting mist from the ground, throwing long shadows across the barbed wire. The prisoners stirred awake on mattresses that felt too soft, as if the night itself had been a trick. Some muttered prayers, others adjusted their uniforms stiff with salt from months of sweat. Breakfast was called with the clang of a bell, and again they braced for gruel. Yet what awaited was steaming oatmeal, eggs scrambled golden, bread that cracked warm at the crust. Coffee, strong and bitter, was poured without stinginess. The men ate slowly at first, cautious, then with the hunger of wolves. Across the hall, American guards drank from chipped mugs and joked in easy voices. The surreal divide between fear and reality widened with every bite. After the meal, rations were handed out with a precision that startled the Germans. Cigarettes, real, factory-rolled, not the twisted scraps of tobacco they had sometimes scrounged from battlefield refuse. Each man received a pack. The prisoners turned them over in their hands, as if the white cylinders might vanish into smoke before they could light them. The ritual of smoking began in silence, men cupping matches with calloused palms, drawing in the first breath with disbelief. Some coughed, the strength of American tobacco hitting harder than what they remembered from home. Then laughter, brief, nervous, but genuine, rose from the tables. A guard smirked, leaning against the wall, as though watching boys unwrap Christmas gifts. The cigarettes became more than tobacco, They were currency, comfort, a symbol of dignity strangely restored. Men began to trade them like coins. One would offer 3 smokes for an extra slice of bread. Another hoarded them under his mattress, as if saving treasure. A young corporal with hollow cheeks bartered 2 for a pencil, eager to write a letter that might never reach his family. The economy of scarcity, born from desperation, revived itself even behind the wire. What surprised them most was that the Americans allowed it, even encouraged it, understanding perhaps that morale was easier to buy with tobacco than with threats. And then, on Sunday evening, came the beer. It was brought out casually, crates stacked against the wall, bottles clinking together like a chorus of glass bells. The Germans stared as guards rolled them into the hall, prying off caps with the flat edge of knives. Some prisoners thought it a cruel trick, that the bottles were filled with something bitter or poisoned. But when the first sip passed trembling lips, the truth broke through, the unmistakable taste of malt, hops, the memory of taverns back in Bavaria or Hamburg. A wave of silence fell, then murmurs, then chuckles that spread like wildfire. One man raised his bottle high and toasted, though to what, no one could say, victory, defeat, or the simple fact of being alive. The sound of laughter mixed with smoke that night, curling toward the rafters. Cigarette tips glowed like fireflies in the dim hall, and beer bottles knocked together in an odd symphony of camaraderie. For men who had marched through dust storms, slept in trenches, and starved on half-rations, the luxury was almost unbearable. Some wept quietly into their sleeves, ashamed that kindness from an enemy hurt more than cruelty ever could. Others sank into silence, the weight of contradiction pressing harder than the barbed wire itself. The conflict was no longer survival, it was belief. What did it mean when the supposed monsters of propaganda handed you comfort in the form of smoke and ale? Personal diaries captured these moments in careful strokes of pencil. One POW scribbled, "Beer in the land of the enemy, impossible, yet here in my hand. Back home our families starve. Here we feast." Another wrote of cigarettes traded for soap, soap traded for a comb, and how such small luxuries felt like salvation. These scraps of testimony would outlast the war, fragments of astonishment preserved by men who had expected humiliation but found routine generosity. Even the Americans could not hide their irony. Guards joked that their captives were eating better than their wives back home, where ration coupons limited sugar, butter, and meat. The contrast was bitter for some, especially farm boys who knew their families scraped through shortages while prisoners dined on meat and potatoes. Yet orders were orders, and the Geneva Convention loomed larger than resentment. The U.S. had chosen to follow its principles to the letter, both for morality and for pragmatism. If German POWs were treated well here, perhaps American soldiers in Europe would see the same. Still, the generosity carried danger. Cigarettes and beer loosened tongues, and the prisoners began to talk. Stories spilled out, about fear, about doubt, about commanders who had led them into deserts and left them to wither. In whispered German, they questioned whether their sacrifice had meaning if the enemy treated them with more respect than their own regime. Some argued it was all a facade, a trick to break their spirit. Others countered that the trick was the propaganda back home. The mess hall became a crucible, where ideology melted and reformed in the heat of contradiction. There were moments almost comical in their absurdity. A sergeant, grizzled and stubborn, swore he would never touch American food. Yet by the third night he was seen sneaking a second helping of stew, cigarette dangling from his lips. A corporal traded nearly all his smokes for chocolate, then sat with sticky fingers and a grin like a child, confessing it was the first sweet he'd tasted in 2 years. Such scenes blurred the image of enemy and friend, reminding them of lives before uniforms, before orders. Humanity crept in, carried on the bitter taste of tobacco and the sweet fizz of beer. The Americans, too, noticed the change. Guards found their work easier. A prisoner with a cigarette in hand was less likely to cause trouble. Discipline softened, if only slightly. There were still strict rules, still barbed wire and rifles, but beneath it all lay an unspoken agreement: comfort in exchange for peace. The cigarettes became as important as the watchtowers, the beer as powerful as the rifles. The war continued beyond the fences, but inside, another battle unfolded, one for the prisoners' minds, where loyalty wavered against unexpected kindness. As spring turned to summer, the camp grew louder with the rhythms of routine. Work details went out to nearby farms, returning sunburned but carrying stories of friendly civilians who offered water and sometimes shared a smile. Cigarettes were tucked behind ears, beer anticipated like a holy ritual. Slowly, disbelief gave way to acceptance, and acceptance to reflection. Some prisoners admitted, only to themselves, that they felt more human here than they had under their own banners. Yet the comfort did not erase the gnawing fear. Rumors trickled in of battles still raging, of devastation in Europe, of families left to suffer while they sipped beer under foreign skies. Each cigarette they lit was tinged with guilt, each bottle of beer with longing. The war had not ended for them, it had only taken on a different face, one that unsettled them more than brutality could. And so, when the lights dimmed and silence fell across the camp once more, the prisoners lay restless. The smoke of the day clung to their clothes, the faint buzz of alcohol hummed in their veins. They closed their eyes, yet the contradiction refused to sleep. How could captivity taste of freedom? How could an enemy hand them kindness without price? And as whispers of these questions drifted through the barracks, one truth lingered, unspoken but sharp. If beer and cigarettes could break faith in the fatherland, what else would come to shatter the lies they had carried so far? By midsummer of 1943, the contradictions were impossible to ignore. Behind the barbed wire, life moved with an order that felt more like routine than punishment. The prisoners had grown lean but not starved. Their skin browned beneath the Texan sun, their muscles filled out from farm labor and ball games. Each day began with the clang of the bell, meals served with clockwork steadiness, and evenings drifting into smoke-filled barracks where men played cards or scribbled in journals. To anyone who had swallowed the dark tales of American cruelty, the camp itself seemed a theater built to mock those lies. Yet the deeper unease came not from hunger or fear, but from the slow collapse of the beliefs they had carried across oceans. The propaganda they had once repeated like scripture had painted the Americans as decadent, brutal, and cowardly, men who relied on machines because they lacked spirit. But the guards they saw each day were young farmers, clerks, and students, shoulders squared beneath khaki, rifles slung with casual confidence. They were neither the monsters described in pamphlets nor the weaklings mocked in training halls. They were ordinary, and that very ordinariness became its own kind of weapon. Watching them toss baseballs in the evening, cigarettes dangling from their mouths, was more destabilizing than any beating could have been. The enemy, it turned out, looked frustratingly human. Books arrived at the camp library, donated by local towns, some in German, some in English. At first the prisoners ignored them, suspicious of tricks hidden in print. But boredom has its own hunger, and soon men thumbed through pages of Goethe and Schiller, or tried halting English from grammar guides. The guards, half amused, sometimes corrected their pronunciation. Words once shouted in anger became lessons shared with a smile. In the mess hall, Americans demonstrated baseball's strange rules. Germans, in turn, taught soccer. The fields became stages for something unthinkable, laughter echoing across languages. 4 men taught to despise weakness. This simple mingling was a quiet act of treason to the Reich. Letters home carried echoes of these discoveries, though censored lines blacked out details. Still, hints slipped through. One prisoner wrote, "We eat more here than our families do at home." Another admitted, "The Americans do not treat us as beasts. They treat us as men." For some, these admissions tore holes in their loyalty, forcing them to reconcile lived experience with years of indoctrination. Others clung harder to ideology, insisting that generosity itself was a tactic of manipulation, a velvet glove over an iron fist. Yet in whispers at night, doubts spread like smoke, impossible to contain once lit. The work details intensified the unraveling. Prisoners were sent to local farms, where they picked cotton, harvested wheat, and dug irrigation ditches under the watch of a single armed guard. Farmers often offered water, sometimes pie or bread. A boy once slipped an apple to a German prisoner, grinning as though it were a game. Such gestures, small but piercing, shook the foundation of hatred more than any speech could. One man confessed later that he thought of that apple more often than the medals pinned to his chest. Kindness, he discovered, was harder to resist than cruelty. Even humor found its way into the cracks of ideology. Prisoners laughed at the Americans' obsession with Coca-Cola, calling it the other national flag. They marveled at jukeboxes playing music in nearby towns, sounds that drifted faintly toward the camp. A guard once tried to explain baseball statistics, and the Germans shook their heads in mock despair, muttering that even war was simpler than such numbers. These absurdities, trivial at first glance, became powerful precisely because they revealed the normal life of an enemy nation. Normalcy itself was propaganda, far stronger than any poster Hitler had waved. Yet not all succumbed easily. In some barracks, die-hard loyalists kept watch, reporting suspected traitors to camp leaders who still clung to the right. Fistfights broke out, arguments flared, men shouted themselves hoarse defending an ideology that was losing its grip with every passing week of humane treatment. The internal conflict sharpened. Was one still a soldier if one admitted the enemy's humanity? Could loyalty survive the evidence of one's own senses? For men who had built their identity on obedience, such questions were dangerous, even lethal. A diary entry recovered years later captured the fracture. We were told Americans would humiliate us. Instead, they gave us cigarettes. We were told they were weaklings. Instead, they worked beside us on farms. If this is weakness, then I no longer understand strength. The words cut like confession, a crack of honesty slipped past the censors. Dozens of such entries survive, each testimony a thread unraveling the tapestry of propaganda. Even the guards noticed the shift. They saw prisoners laughing at jokes in broken English, forming bands that played folk songs, carving toys out of scrap wood. These were not hardened ideologues but men discovering fragments of life beyond the Reich's reach. Some guards pitied them. Others grew fond, recognizing in them the same restless youth they had left behind in Kansas, Ohio, or New York. This sympathy made discipline complex. There were still fences, still rules, still rifles, but beneath the surface lay an acknowledgement of shared humanity. The central conflict sharpened as autumn approached. German prisoners found themselves caught between memory and present reality. Propaganda clung like a shadow, whispering that every kindness was a trap, every laugh a trick. Yet the smell of tobacco, the taste of beer, the easy humor of young guards, all of it testified to a different truth. It was not America that seemed hollow, but the ideology they had carried so fiercely. Some resolved to hold faith until death. Others quietly surrendered, not to a nation, but to the recognition that the world was larger than the slogans painted on their banners. For one young soldier, barely out of his teens, the breaking point came on a warm evening when he sat on the barrack steps, cigarette glowing in his hand. He watched fireflies blink in the fields beyond the fence, and for the first time in months, he allowed himself to imagine life after war, not as a soldier, not as a servant of the Reich, but simply as a man. The thought terrified him more than combat had. If his enemies could make him dream, what power did they truly hold? The camp slept that night under a sky heavy with stars. In silence, men wrestled with questions that no order from Berlin could answer. They had come expecting chains. Instead they had been given beer and smoke, books and games. The propaganda that once fueled them now seemed fragile, a voice drowned beneath the sounds of laughter, music, and the crack of baseball bats. yet deep inside, unease twisted like a blade. If their old certainties had collapsed so easily, what would remain when the war itself ended? And in that question, heavy and unresolved, lay the shadow of the next revelation waiting just beyond the fence. Winter crept slowly into the heart of Texas, though to the German prisoners the mild chill felt like spring compared to the frozen fields they had once trudged across in Europe. By late 1944, news filtered through the wire that the war was turning against their homeland. The Americans said little, but the prisoners could read defeat in the lines of their guards' newspapers, glimpsed when pages fluttered in the wind. Stalingrad, Normandy, the push toward the Rhine, all whispered of a Reich collapsing. Inside the camp, however, daily life still pulsed with routine. Meals served on time, cigarettes distributed, and, on holidays, beer slid across wooden tables like a promise that humanity had not perished entirely. The longer they remained, the more the camp became a mirror that distorted their old loyalties. Men who had once saluted under swastikas now found themselves humming American tunes carried faintly from guards' radios. On farms where they labored, civilians treated them with pragmatic decency. One farmer's wife once handed a prisoner a slice of pie, steam rising from its crust, and the soldier, unable to find words, bowed his head as though offered a sacrament. Such moments planted seeds that would grow long after the war. The propaganda that had once thundered certainty now seemed brittle against the quiet weight of kindness. Some men clung to ideology, their pride stiffening even as their beliefs eroded. They insisted the Americans were calculating, that beer and cigarettes were weapons more dangerous than bullets. But late at night, when they lay awake in barracks lit only by the glow of smoldering tobacco, many could not deny that the treatment had reshaped them. Letters written years later revealed that what remained etched in memory was not the barbed wire, but the warmth of small mercies. A guard sharing a story of home, a fellow prisoner trading half his ration for a smile, the astonishing permission to play soccer under open skies. The Americans, too, were changed by the presence of their unlikely guests. Guards returned home with tales of German soldiers who sang hymns by lantern light, who built model ships from scrap wood, who thanked them earnestly for cigarettes. Some farmers later recalled that the best cotton harvests they ever had came from the hands of prisoners who worked without complaint, grateful to trade labor for humanity. The line between enemy and neighbor blurred, not erased, but smudged in ways that troubled easy definitions of war. The central conflict that had shadowed every cigarette smoked and every bottle of beer drained now surfaced in full. What did it mean to fight an enemy who, in the moment of capture, became something more complicated than a caricature? For the Germans, the challenge was to reconcile loyalty to a crumbling regime with gratitude toward those who embodied the very nation they were told to despise. For the Americans, it was the tension between righteous fury against a brutal war machine and the recognition that individual soldiers were just men, tired and far from home. By the time the war ended in May 1945, many German POWs had spent months, some years, within these American camps. When the gates finally opened, the relief was tinged with sorrow. They longed to return home, yet home was rubble, hunger, and uncertainty. Some feared that leaving the camps meant stepping back into a life harsher than captivity had ever been. The irony weighed heavily. Freedom promised suffering, while imprisonment had offered food, safety, and, in strange moments, dignity. Decades later, testimonies revealed how profoundly these experiences lingered. Former prisoners wrote of returning to Germany with memories of kindness that clashed with the devastation they found. One man confessed that when he first sipped beer in Texas, he felt his faith in the Reich collapse more completely than on any battlefield. Another admitted that every cigarette he lit reminded him of a guard who had offered one with a grin, shattering the wall of hatred he had carried. These men became storytellers in their own right, passing tales to children and grandchildren, shaping how post-war generations understood both enemy and ally. Not all legacies were personal. On a larger scale, America's treatment of prisoners became a case study in the power of principle. By upholding the Geneva Convention with rigor, the United States had demonstrated that even in total war, decency could serve as strategy. Reports suggest that thousands of Allied POWs in Germany benefited indirectly, as German authorities, aware of their soldiers' treatment abroad, hesitated to break the rules too openly. The chain of kindness stretched across oceans, its logic rooted not only in morality but in reciprocity. And yet, beneath the history of regulations and statistics lay the quieter truth. It was the human details that endured. The clink of bottles on a summer night. The glow of cigarettes as men sat shoulder to shoulder, enemies sharing silence more intimate than speeches. The taste of food that reminded them of life before war. These were the moments that rewrote convictions, not through force but through the disarming power of ordinary humanity. There were reunions too. Years after the war, some former POWs returned to the towns where they had once been captive. They knocked on farmhouse doors, now as immigrants seeking to start anew. Others wrote letters of thanks to guards, decades too late but no less heartfelt. One American farmer remembered a man named Heinrich who had worked his fields. Heinrich's children would later visit that farm, carrying stories their father had told about unexpected kindness in a foreign land. These threads wove a tapestry of reconciliation, fragile yet enduring. The legacy of those camps lies not in military reports or government documents but in the strange intimacy forged between captor and captive. It is in the way propaganda dissolved under the weight of small decencies, in the way beer and cigarettes became more than luxuries, they became instruments of transformation. For the Germans, they were reminders that enemies could be merciful, for the Americans, that mercy could be stronger than vengeance. The war ended, but those simple acts outlasted the gunfire. As the last lights went out in the barracks on their final night, men lay awake, knowing they would soon step beyond the fences. Some whispered prayers, others smoked the last of their rations in silence. The ember of each cigarette glowed in the darkness, tiny flames burning against uncertainty. They could not know then how their memories would shape lives long after the war, how kindness given in captivity would echo across generations. But as smoke curled upward, disappearing into the rafters, one truth lingered in every breath. The war had taught them fear, but captivity in America had taught them something far more dangerous to carry home: doubt.